Alright guys, Willem here, back with a new video, and in this video, as we near the 5-year anniversary of this channel, I've decided to redo the video that started it all, my first ever video, that being a guide to International Survivor. Where obviously we're here at the beginning of 2024, where I originally did mine in 2019, proceeded to remake it in 2020, but here we are to update with all the seasons that have happened since then. Now again, this will be a non-spoiler video. I'll be running through each season, giving my unspoiled thoughts, and also give recommendations on which seasons to approach from people that haven't watched them. Now, in my previous videos, I did end up structuring this kind of chronologically. However, here I decided to go a different route and more so structure this series by series, kind of talking about them in order of importance. Again, this will be including every English language season of Survivor. I've personally not watched many non-English series, as it's obviously very difficult to watch a show like Survivor when you don't understand what's going on. I don't really want to commit to something unless the entire series is fully subtitled, though there will be one non-English language season that we will be talking about at the very end of the video. Let's start it all off. Let's talk about the series that is definitely the most important of the series in the modern day, the series that has one of the more extensive histories and one of the bigger audiences of the bunch, and that is Australian Survivor, where obviously Australian Survivor is still currently running. We have a new season coming up in Titans versus Rebels, which will be the 9th season of the Network 10 version of the show, which is the one that we're going to be talking about first here, the modern version. And to just give general thoughts about Australian Survivor, I've been pretty outspoken in the fact that I personally don't like Australian Survivor's format. Australian Survivor is portrayed in a way that's very different from the typical US season, where obviously episodes are longer in Australian Survivor, typically being over an hour without commercials, which I think can at points lead to filler. Also, because it's Australian TV, they do typically end up having 24 episodes. Mind you, a couple seasons have more than that. Though through that also have expanded casts of 24 people, but that still opens it up for non-elimination episodes, which do happen periodically, which leads to dumb twists to make those non-eliminations happen, which can be frustrating at points with the series. And beyond that, really just the presentation is just so in your face, where the way the Australian Survivor likes to tell its story is to really give main character energy to a small grouping of people and then consistently show them over and over and over again, usually them saying the same type of things in their confessionals over and over and over again, while really leaving most of the rest of the cast to dry. Or throughout Australian Survivor history, there's been numerous people that have zero confessionals by the time they go home. Again, like, I personally don't like that presentation style of Australian Survivor. Some people do. Some people love Australian Survivor and talk about it as it's the best Survivor series out there. And again, good for those people, but that's not really me. Mind you, despite that, there are obviously great Australian Survivor seasons. And really, without a doubt, Australian Survivor is the series to recommend if you want to dip your toes into International Survivor. I mean, again, it is a series that is currently running still, a series with the biggest fan base, the series with the most prospects moving forward, while again, still being a pretty solid series. So again, definitely a series to recommend. But going through season by season, I mean, it all started off with Australian Survivor 2016, a season that is kind of a rough start for the series. Now, it's an interesting season, the fact that the first half is incredible. Probably one of the best pre-juries in the history of Survivor. The problem is that the post-jury is rough, where particularly the first like 2/3 of it is probably one of the biggest slogs in Survivor history. But there are also great characters, but in Australian Survivor fashion, there's also some complete duds. Again, it is very much a mixed bag of a season. It is a season that, again, ideally the first season that you would watch would be a better season than 2016, which is probably the only thing that would make me say don't watch this first, as otherwise I'm personally someone that likes to start from the very beginning, continue from that point forward, and obviously if you want to do that, 2016 is the place to start. But again, there definitely are better seasons out there, so again, it makes it a bit tough to fully recommend as your first season. But with that, we move on to Australian Survivor 2017, which is pretty much a better season in almost every way. I mean, this is universally looked at as one of the better Australian Survivor seasons. Many consider it the best Australian Survivor season, and it is a very strong season, a very consistent season, one with a pretty strong cast, some pretty big game moments, and a mostly unpredictable ride. I do think this is a very strong season to have as your first. Now, there's a minor hiccup in that, in the fact that the very beginning of the season does spoil the winner of the previous season. So if you want to remain unspoiled on 2016, I would recommend probably like skipping the first few minutes of 2017 to fully avoid that, which I should mention, this is actually a common occurrence on Australian Survivor seasons, where really you will be having to skip the intros for most seasons to avoid being spoiled on the previous season, as again, that's just something they do for some reason. If you do want to start with a bang, start with one of the better seasons, and one that you can mostly enjoy to its fullest without previous context, I do think Australian Survivor 2017 is a pretty good place to start. The 2017 ends up being a bit of a turning point for Australian Survivor, where the show ended up barely being renewed after 2017. Despite obviously the reception to the season was extremely high, ratings really did not reflect that. Through that, they made a massive shakeup for the following season. That season being Australian Survivor Champions versus Contenders, the first theme season, which from this point forward, every season has had a theme since then. Particularly a versus theme, which Australian Survivor seems to love, as they like pitting two groups against each other, and with also their love of having two tribes. Every season from this point forward are two tribes of 12, with the only one that wasn't was the first season with 3 tribes of 8. But also a change from this season is the fact that the number of days was slightly reduced, and also the number of episodes was reduced to only 24 episodes instead of 26, which ends up being the mainstay moving forward. As for the season itself, in many ways, it's essentially just the inverse of 2016, especially from a public reception perspective. It's one that is, again, pretty mixed for the most part. It does have a relatively slow start, with many people calling the pre-merge pretty dull. The post-merge is incredible, though, which kind of makes it all worth it. But again, it's a season that isn't loved by the public. However, I personally do enjoy this season. I like it more than most people. I do find more aspects of the pre-merge better than others. Again, the post-merge is one of the best in really just Survivor history. So it's a season that I think is definitely worth watching eventually, though I do think it's tough to recommend this as a first season, even though, again, this is a season that you could probably enjoy without any real context outside the show. And to make it more appealing to US audiences, Russell Hantz is on this season, so that's something. But again, one I wouldn't really fully recommend as your first season. But either way, with the success of Champions versus Contenders, we then cut to the following year, where we get Champions versus Contenders 2, which did lead to a lot of worry in the preseason of how much they're milking this theme, though the season ended up being pretty good for most people. Now, I've been pretty outspoken in the fact that I personally don't like this season as much as most people. However, despite that, obviously most people do love this season. And it does have some of the biggest characters in Australian Survivor history. It has some really big moves here and there. My personal gripe with it is the fact that I do find certain parts of the season a bit slower than others, and also just in general, the editing of the season is really abhorrent, with just so many people are simply just not on the show, and that's obviously an issue. But again, it's a season that most people like. This is usually paired up with 2017 as one of the more popular seasons. Now, I will mention that this does have a returning player on this cast, a returning player from 2017, that, to be fair, you don't really need to watch 2017 to fully get his character on this season, but I think it is something that would make me recommend 2017 more than this season. That and the fact that, again, I personally don't like it as much. But again, either way, it's a season that most people like. Wouldn't be a terrible place to start, but I would still recommend 2017 more. But with that, we're now into those seasons that I haven't talked about in a video yet. And with that, we cut to the year of 2020. For the 5th season of Australian Survivor, we end up finally getting Australian Survivor All-Stars, which felt very early in the show's history, truth be told, and considering the overall cast, there are a lot of question marks on this cast that make you realize that, yeah, they probably did it a little early, but it's still a relatively strong cast on paper. Most of the biggest names in the series' history do appear on this season. The problem is the season is simply just not that great. I mean, there are certainly moments in this season. There's at least one like really all-time great vote off, and there's an all-time great character that really takes up a lot of the screen time of the season. But outside of that, again, this season is a little bit rough to watch. Now, it's not to the point of the original All-Stars where it just has this like dire tone. There's a lot of ickiness. There isn't really that. It's a mostly passable experience. It's not one where I'm like dreading watching this season, but it's also one where, again, there's simply just better seasons out there. And also, obviously, considering the fact that it is a returning season, it is not a good place to start. And this obviously contains players from all 4 of the previous seasons, to where, again, I wouldn't recommend watching this until you've watched all 4 of those, considering I feel like all 4 of them do play a factor into how this season plays out, to which obviously this season will end up spoiling a lot of moments from those seasons, though even when you get around to watching it, probably not the greatest season. But then we get to where the show kind of gets a soft reboot. where obviously All-Stars ended up airing at the beginning of COVID, which sadly did halt Australian Survivor production to where initially we were going to be getting 2 seasons in the year 2020 and presumably moving forward. However, because of COVID, the next season in Australian Survivor Brains versus Brawns didn't air until mid-2021, in a position where the 1 season a year ended up returning, which in retrospect, thank God, as I think I would have lost my sanity if we had 2 Australian Survivor seasons a year. But Brains vs. Brawn ended up being a bit of a shakeup for Australian Survivor. I believe there was a new showrunner for this season, and in ways it definitely shows. I mean, it very much feels like this season was just hitting the gas at all fronts. I mean, this is a season that has so many twists and advantages and different things happening at all times that it felt like they really just shoehorned in everything they could to make something happen every episode, which that's obviously just annoying from a game standpoint. However, it did make good TV at points. Now, there are certain twists that certainly didn't, and some that obviously ruined the integrity of the game, but again, I do think I come out of the twist aspect of the season largely at a wash. But beyond that, this does have a lot of great characters. I mean, again, there are obviously the duds, but I do still feel like this is one of the better seasons of Australian Survivor, despite its blatant issues in terms of how messed up the game format is. And also, for down the road in the series, I do think it'll end up being one of the more important seasons of the show, with it playing a major impact into a later season that we'll talk about. And again, considering its nature as kind of a soft reboot, it doesn't really end up referencing many points of previous seasons, and again, it's an entirely new cast, something that is pretty rare for Australian Survivor. So in many ways, this is a pretty great place to start Australian Survivor, especially if you're okay with there being these potentially game-breaking twists, especially if you want to see things that are going to be important for the modern-day Australian Survivor. I feel like this is a pretty good place to start. But with that, we now move on to 2022, where the season we're going to be talking about here is Australian Survivor Blood versus Water. Obviously bringing the Blood versus Water theme from the US over to Australia in a weird mix mash of people, where obviously in the original in the US, it was a returnee and their loved one. In San Juan del Sur, it was just all newbies. This is a mix of random people, mostly newbies. However, we do get some returnees. We get a returnee from Contenders 2. We have a pair of returnees from 2017, along with the fact that we also have the appearance of Sandra Diaz-Twine, who's there for daughter Nina, which, again, really random how all this played out. Though at the same time, sadly, this is one of the weaker seasons of the series, where this is probably my personal least favorite. While there are some big moments here and there, as with most Australian Survivor seasons, it also just feels like a season where no one's really having fun. It definitely has one of the darkest tones of an Australian Survivor season. And there are long stretches of the season that are just kind of mundane. So again, I do think it's a tough season to really recommend, though if you do want to see the Blood versus Water theme really tested, I do feel like this is probably the season that tests the theme the most in terms of showing how much having a loved one in the game really impacts your game. So at least there's something to that, but again, overall, kind of a rough watch. But with that, we now get to the most recent Australian Survivor season, the season from 2023, and that is Heroes versus Villains, which for many people, this was the first season of Australian Survivor for them, considering, spoiler, I mean, this is one of the strongest seasons Australian Survivor's ever had, and word of how great this season was did really spread throughout the internet to where many people started watching Australian Survivor for the first time because of some of the insane moments that were happening on this season. And straight up, yes, this is probably my personal favorite Australian Survivor season at this point. It feels like a season that fixed most of the issues of the recent Survivor, where it did bring in a new showrunner who seems to have more awareness at what he's doing, seems to have more care for the game. It also is a season that brought in new editors from Survivor South Africa, which, as we'll talk about, is probably the best edited Survivor series potentially worldwide. And again, it really felt like from a production standpoint, everything came together for this season, and the game plays out in a really dynamic way. It's one of the most fun, consistent rides of an Australian Survivor season. The issue for recommending it as your first season is that it is essentially a fans versus favorites season, where almost half the cast are returnees, not exactly half, because that's Australian Survivor for you, but also interestingly not like the typical fans versus favorites in the US, as the returnees being split across the two tribes, which I should also mention, it is dumb that they have heroes versus villains with newbies that are literally just outright calling normal people villains, but whatever. Again, it is a strong season, but it is one that, again, has returnees. You're going to need that context, particularly Brains versus Brawn is definitely the most important season of the bunch, but still a really great season, a season that, again, I wouldn't recommend first, though I could definitely recommend this second after watching Brains vs. Brawn. And obviously we got to talk about the upcoming season in Titans vs. Rebels, which literally starts in just a few weeks time at the time of this recording, where obviously this would actually be a good place to start, where, while again, obviously we don't know about the quality of the season, I mean, this is going to be, again, a season airing very soon. It's also an entirely newbie cast here, to where again, it could potentially be a good place to start, especially if you want to enjoy the discourse around the season as it's airing, to where again, that would obviously be a good option here as well. So just in general, with starting with the Network 10 series of Australian Survivor, I do feel like the good places to start are obviously starting from the beginning. You can start with 2017 or Brains vs. Brawn, as long as you skip the initial intros, considering the spoilers there, or again, just start with the most recent season and just see how that goes. There we go. I mean, that's the Network 10 Australian Survivor Series. Now let's talk about the 2 seasons that predate that. That, again, are not part of the Australian Survivor canon. These aren't seasons that are recognized as part of the modern show. These are seasons that ended up airing beforehand from different networks. We're still going to mention them. First one, going all the way back to 2002, where in place of Survivor Marquesas in Australia, they ended up airing Australian Survivor 2002, which is a mostly bad season. I mean, it is a season that is just very dry. It's kind of lacking of humor. Its cast is pretty boring. It takes place in a pretty boring setting, just along the bay in Australia. It's a season that I do think is just overall very rough to watch. Would not recommend it unless you're a completionist and want to watch every English language season. There is one saving grace in the season, the fact that there is a player that, especially for 2002, was playing a bit ahead of their time. Though even that isn't fully recognized until the post-merge, and again, in general, it's a bit of a rough watch to where would not fully recommend it. And kind of on the opposite side of things, in 2006 in Australia, we ended up getting Celebrity Australian Survivor, which is a train wreck, and probably one of the biggest train wrecks in Survivor history, where people talk about how crazy Gabon is. Like, this is Gabon on steroids. And this is a season that in many ways kind of feels like a parody of Survivor. While it is a genuine season of Survivor, and the fact that it is people living on an island voting each other out, overall game structure and just the amount of weird twists involved in the game, and also the wackiness of the cast itself, who are, again, celebrities, it just leads to this being, again, a very weird season. Again, kind of the opposite of Australian Survivor 2002, where, again, it's not boring, but it's still not good. It's kind of a train wreck in like the worst way possible, but to me it's still a watchable season. Again, it's kind of funny just how much of a train wreck this season is. So again, one that again I wouldn't recommend unless you're a completionist. But with that, let's finally move on to another series of International Survivor, going to what I would dub as the second most important series of International Survivor, and that is Survivor South Africa, which has a much rockier history than Australian Survivor, where obviously there you could just recommend all the Network 10 seasons. It's a series that's still continuing on. I mean, Survivor South Africa has never really been on TV consistently. It's usually been in bunches of like 2 seasons, then taking a break. And after its 9th season, which just aired in 2022, we did learn that the series is going on hiatus once again. And while many people looked at that as like a full-out cancellation of the show, I more so look at it as the show, again, probably taking a few years break like it did in the past. But still, I mean, it's a show that isn't currently airing anymore. However, portions of Survivor South Africa are some of the best international Survivor you're ever going to see. Where Survivor South Africa is a series that, especially the more modern seasons, are run by massive super fans of Survivor. I mean, LaRue Botha is the showrunner of season 6 through 9, who, again, is clearly a super fan of the show, very accessible online, did extensive interviews with RHAP. Again, he is a really big fan, and you could very much tell that influence on the show. However, it doesn't start off as strong. Where Survivor South Africa, again, after he takes control of the show, it's easily the most consistent of the international series. I mean, the way the show is edited and presented is by far better than the likes of Australian Survivor. The edit is a lot more balanced, and the storyline isn't as in your face, where unlike Australian Survivor, where you can very much tell who more than likely is going to win from very early on in most seasons, Survivor South Africa is not that. I mean, Survivor South Africa takes a different style of editing in that it just genuinely tries to portray events like they happened, which, again, mind-blowing for reality TV, but again, very opposed to Survivor US, where Survivor US tries to build up these series-long storylines, particularly those revolving around the people that make it to the end. Survivor South Africa doesn't. It simply just shows what happened, and through that, it leads to it feeling like a much more genuine product. However, again, that doesn't happen until much later on. Brawn, where we do start off a bit rough, and let's start talking about the seasons themselves. Starting off with Season 1, Survivor SA Panama, which was in 2006, which is not an entirely bad season from my point of view, but again, like old school Survivor South Africa very much feels in line with many older international Survivor seasons, which were simply just not that good. I do think this is probably the best. Definitely better than Australian Survivor 2002 and some other seasons we'll talk about later, but it's still not good. And they have a really wonky format on this season as well, where this season essentially has a post-merge Edge of Extinction, along with a weird Final Four format that is actually even worse than forced fire making, where essentially from the Final Four on, it's all determined by challenges of who gets to the final two, which I believe is a format that's used in a lot of other non-English international seasons. But again, just overall a really bad format, but a season that isn't entirely bad. And if you do want to start SA from the very beginning, again, this is obviously the place to start, but you obviously have to acknowledge the growing pains that are going to be with it. And really, more so, I would recommend this only for completionists. But before moving on to season 2, I do want to talk about a season that I have not actually personally watched, the only English language season of Survivor I have not watched because there's no copy of it online, and that is Survivor Africa Panama, which was a season that was filmed back to back with Survivor South Africa Panama and does follow a very similar format in terms of game structure. However, instead of its cast obviously coming from South Africa, its cast comes from all over Africa. It's a pan-regional season, but again, no copy of it is available online, so that's why I haven't watched it. But I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that it exists here. But with that, we move on to season 2 of Survivor SA Malaysia, which took place the following year and is kind of worse than Panama. I mean, in most ways, it's pretty much exactly the same. I mean, format is a little bit better, to where now only the final 4 round is determined by a challenge. There's still a final 3 round that plays out normally. In many ways, does feel very old school Survivor. Feels like a season kind of in line with the first 4 seasons of Survivor US, though just without the really iconic characters that came from those seasons that made those seasons interesting. And it's one that does have some ickiness at points, and it really just ends up being one of the lesser seasons of Survivor in the grand scheme of things. So again, one that's tough to recommend for people outside of completionists. Then we take a break following this, to where Survivor South Africa has 2 seasons off, only to come back in 2010 for Survivor South Africa Santa Carolina, which ends up being a celebrity season of the show. Again, seeming like this gimmick that was there to try to bring in more of the audience, though obviously I don't know any of these people, as these were South African celebrities. And this is a very mixed bag of a season. It's a season that the first half of the season is pretty rough, not much really going on there that's that entertaining, but the second half is insane. And there's a certain player on this season that is really in the lexicon of best Survivor South Africa players. The problem is that she's the only one. I mean, this was a cast that seemed like as a whole didn't really care that much about the game. We're kind of just there for the paycheck. But again, there are some pretty insane moments throughout that I do feel like are worth watching this season for. So I feel like this is a season I would recommend more so than the first 2, especially from just a general watching perspective. But again, you still have to get through a pretty rough pre-merge to get to the good bits, but still not the best that Survivor SA has to offer. And with that, we then move on to the next season of Survivor SA, which took place the following year. That being Survivor SA Maldives. I think Maldives here is the most mid-season of Survivor, which again, I love Survivor. I think Survivor is one of the best reality shows out there. However, this is probably a season that definitively comes to my mind as the most middle-of-the-road season that there is, which is still a good season of reality television as a whole. Again, I do think this is a pretty solid season with some pretty big characters, some pretty big moments, but there's a lot of other rounds that are just simply just fine. But I don't think it ever delves into it just being outright boring. Like, it's mostly just a fine season of Survivor. Feels very much middle school Survivor, kind of in line with the early teens of Survivor US. It's the first season of International Survivor to involve the proper hidden immunity idol in the way that it functions in the US nowadays. It's also a half and half season of half celebs and half plebs, to where it's handled in more of an Australian Survivor Heroes Villains way, where they're intermixed on tribes. And again, that leads to some interesting dynamics. Overall, again, this is a fine season. I think it is the best season of Survivor SA up to this point. However, it's still a season that I don't know if I fully recommend, outside the fact that one player from the season does later return for a future season. And if you want the full context around that player, this would be a season to watch. But outside that, even though it is a season I recommend more than the previous seasons, it is one that I think should be mostly left for completionists. And with that, we then move on to the final season of SA before the modern era, but one that is still relatively recent, going all the way to 2014, where here we have Survivor SA Champions. Or again, this is a season that aired literally the same year as Survivor Cagayan. It's also a season that you could very much tell the influence Survivor US had on this season, and the fact that the gameplay was really ramped up with a lot of references to Russell Hantz on this season. You could tell his influence here. There definitely seem to be more fans of the show, not as many as you would expect nowadays, but again, still fans of the show that actually cared about the game. While there are some slow points here and there, I mean, this is a pretty insane season, one that I think could be up there with the all-time great seasons if it wasn't for the fact that it's so harmed by some pretty dumb production issues. The biggest of which being the Champions theme, where when you hear the term Champions, I think your initial worry is that, oh, is this a returnee season? But no, Champions in this season equates to two sports champions who have nothing to do with Survivor, and both of which were not fans of Survivor, did not care about Survivor, who are brought on to coach the two teams and are simply just there because they wanted to have two sports champions to promote the season. And they end up hogging up so much of the airtime early on the season, which is really disappointing, especially considering the fact that they don't really get the game of Survivor. And despite that, the cast itself is strong. They are making big moves. There are really interesting gameplay things going on outside of, again, there's also a massive bout of ickiness in the early game as well, which is not great. But again, the Champions theme does have a major negative impact on the season. But again, the season's still good despite that, where the post-merge is still one of the best post-merges in just Survivor history. Really insane stuff going on there. And even beyond that, I mean, this is probably one of the most important seasons to watch before the later returnee season. So because of all those things, again, I would still recommend this season. Now, again, I think it is going to be a bit rough at points, just due to how bad the twist is and the season not fully picking up until around the time of the swap. But I still personally enjoy this season, and considering its importance for future seasons, I would still recommend watching this, though I don't know if it's the first season you should watch. But with that, we then finally get to the modern era of Survivor South Africa. We cut forward to 2018, where we get Survivor South Africa Philippines, a season that is very important in my overall history with International Survivor, as this was the season that really expanded my view on International Survivor, which eventually bled into one of the reasons why I started this channel, where, I mean, I had watched Australian Survivor before, but it was the airing of Philippines that made me go back and watch literally every English language season. And because I have a personal connection to Philippines, but even despite that, Philippines is still very much revered as one of the best Survivor South Africa has to offer, and I would still say it is the best season of the bunch. It is just an insane season, where going back to how I talked about Celebrity Australian Survivor and how insane that season is, the same things can be said about this, but in the context of a genuine Survivor season, where, again, Celebrity Australian Survivor feels very much like a parody. This season feels very much just like a group of very messy players playing very hard and making insane decisions, and there still being some iconic characters, some of the best characters on any Survivor series. Again, this is just all around a pretty great season. To me, this is the definitive place to start. Again, it has no connection to any other season. It's just an insane season in its own right, and it very much feels in line with the more modern Survivor seasons. So I feel like there's really nothing stopping you from watching the season. It's one of the best out there, and definitely one I would recommend. But with that, we then jump forward one more year to where we get another season here in Survivor SA Island of Secrets, which is a season that is not nearly as strong as Philippines, though still a season I would recommend. I think it's a very different season to Philippines, not as wacky and humorous as the previous season, not really as explosive as the previous season, though it's still a very well-told story. Again, probably one of the bigger examples of how the turn, maybe not the most riveting gameplay in the world, into a still solid Survivor season, kind of being a prime example of why I think Survivor SA has the best production team out of any more recent Survivor series, because this is a season that probably could have been a massive dud if not portrayed properly, though it was portrayed properly, and through that it becomes a pretty solid season. Again, still not great, but one I would still recommend watching at some point. It does play some factor into the later returnee season, but obviously not one I would recommend as your first season. Now, originally there was going to be a season in the year 2020. However, obviously due to COVID, the season was delayed, to which in 2021, we did get the return to Survivor South Africa with Survivor South Africa Immunity Island, a season that is also very strong, typically looked at as one of the better Survivor South Africa seasons. Pretty much feels in line with Survivor South Africa Philippines, though just a bit more normal, where while there are some really great characters on this season and some really dynamic gameplay, it obviously doesn't feel as wacky as what happened on Philippines, but still a very strong season. Still one I could recommend. I think this is also still a pretty solid starting point for Survivor SA. I mean, really, this 3-season stretch are all seasons that do play a factor into the later returnee season, and considering how disconnected they are, no returning players, never really reference each other. Again, you can really watch them in any order. And considering this season's like near quality to that of Philippines, again, I think you can start off with this one. It's really up to you. I personally think Philippines is a more explosive way to start, but Immunity Island is also very, very strong. You really go with either one. And with that, that brings us to the most recent season of Survivor South Africa, which if this is the final season of the show, I think it's a nice way to send it off on, and that is Survivor South Africa Return of the Outcasts, which obviously ends up being Survivor South Africa's first returnee season, essentially a second chance season, but done in a pretty interesting way, where essentially the tribe divisions end up being post-mergers versus pre-mergers, which adds a really interesting dynamic to the people that are brought back, creating these inherent underdogs and giving them a pretty solid storyline, also giving us a pretty interesting crop of returnees, some that are pleasant surprises, some that are not, but overall, I do think the season turned out very strong, where I think on paper it's a season that's largely in line with Immunity Island. Again, not crazy and wacky in the way that Philippines is, though still has a lot of strong gameplay, big characters, big moves. Criticism that comes from this season, though, is the way it's presented, where sadly, due to the success of Australian Survivor in South Africa, the network decided to mandate that this season was essentially made as if it was Australian Survivor, where we do have a 24 episode structure. However, due to LaRue Botha obviously being a massive fan of Survivor, he didn't want to add in non-elimination rounds, but through that, it does kind of harm the pacing of the show to a degree, where the end game in particular is a bit of a slog just due to how slow it's taken, due to having to break up rounds of gameplay between multiple episodes. And again, like, that is definitely a criticism of this season, but overall, it's still a very strong season, a very satisfying returnee season. And when that, again, if this was the way that the series ended, I think this is a pretty good way for it to end. But obviously not a season to watch first. I mean, I think you definitely need to watch seasons 5 through 8 before watching this season. With, again, there also being a returnee from season 4, though it's not 100% necessary, but still wouldn't be bad to watch that season either. But again, to watch this as a season to end your journey of the series, I think it is a pretty satisfying one. But to wrap up Survivor South Africa, I mean, straight up the best season to start off here is with Survivor SA Philippines. So Immunity Island's not a bad place to start either. Both are very strong seasons. Or you can start from the beginning, though, again, straight up, the earlier seasons of the show are not really that talked about and not really that integral to anything that happens following this. So again, I would just recommend those for just full-on completionists. While I do think seasons 5 through 9 are really the more integral seasons to the show that you should watch if you are a massive Survivor fan. But those are two big series out of the way. Now let's run through the series that only have a few seasons. Starting off with Survivor New Zealand, which only had 2 seasons, both in back-to-back years, 2017, 2018, kind of springing off the success of Australian Survivor, though really the 2 seasons here are radically different from each other. Season 1, Survivor NZ Nicaragua, is a bit of a mess. It's a season that I think could have been an okay middle school style season of Survivor, but they really had to ruin it through the usage of Redemption Island, which is there the entire season, which even then on its own right isn't entirely bad. What makes it bad though is how it structures the season, where because of Redemption Island and the network wanting expanded episode count, we'd have 2 full episodes per round of gameplay, where really the only thing that happens in the first episode of the round is the Redemption Island duel, which is just boring. And through that, the overall pacing of the season is just very much off. Really a season that I think is tough to recommend, though still one obviously necessary for completionists. But then the following year, we then got Survivor New Zealand Thailand Season 2, which is actually a pretty good season, which is strange because it obviously learns off of pretty much everything they did wrong in Nicaragua, where it's a more traditional Survivor season. It very much plays out like a middle school season of Survivor, with the inclusion of idols, there being a lot more dynamic of gameplay, people seeming to care a lot more about the game, and there being some pretty massive moves made throughout the season. Again, it is a pretty solid season of the show, but sadly it didn't translate to ratings, where obviously it got canceled immediately afterwards. Though this is a season that I think I could genuinely recommend if you just want to watch a pretty isolated Survivor season at some point, where I think the season has a lot to offer, some pretty decent characters, some really interesting gameplay. While the pace is still a little bit slower than what you would expect from US, it's still a pretty consistently solid season and one that I would recommend. But we jump from a good season to a pair of really bad seasons, where now we're going to be talking about probably the worst batch of international Survivor seasons, where here we're going to be talking about Survivor UK, where we had 2 old school seasons that were latched watching off the success of Survivor Borneo, where the following year in 2001, we got Survivor UK Pulau Tiga, which wasn't entirely bad, but Aussie was no Survivor Borneo. I mean, Survivor Borneo was a season that was filled with very riveting personalities from the likes of Rich, Rudy, Sue, Colleen, Jervis, Greg. This season has no one to that caliber, where it's a much drier season. Now, I will say, I do think there is one player in particular, which is probably a better player than anyone that we see in Survivor Borneo, but it's still not a great season. Now, it's at least better than the following season, so at least there's that. But still one of the weaker Survivor seasons I've watched worldwide. And again, fully one you would only watch as a completionist. And speaking of that, let's get to the following season that happened the next year in Survivor UK Panama, which is the worst season of Survivor I've ever watched, where it's straight up just boring, and the fact that the game plays out in the most stagnant way possible, along with the fact that the cast itself is just simply not that interesting, where there's only like one kind of fun character on this season. That person doesn't even make it that far. And to add on to that, Survivor Panama has some big format changes from the previous season, where Pulau Tiga very much plays out exactly the same as Survivor Borneo format wise. This season has a reduced cast of only 12, merging at 8, a final 2 where the public gets a jury vote, along with a 2-part merge episode where nothing happens. Really, again, this is one of the most boring seasons of Survivor that's out there. 100% do not watch this unless you really want to go for full completion, as really, I don't think this season really brings anything to the table. And now for the 2023 reboot of Survivor UK, which obviously just aired last year, which is surprisingly a season that I am actually recommending here, which really blew my mind, as obviously, I mean, as I talked about the last 2 seasons of UK, both of them are pretty bad. And 2023 reboot, to be honest, did start off pretty bad. I will say, like, if you do struggle getting through the first few episodes, I think it's 100% understandable. However, the season definitely gets better as it goes along. And I think by the end of the season, it just feels like this really interesting trek through Survivor's history. It feels like a show that continues to evolve, where at the very beginning, it does very much give these very old school Survivor parallels to it, essentially just feeling like a modernized version of the old UK show. But the show seems to progress like episode by episode, to where by the end, I mean, we're essentially in like middle school Survivor. Again, like it definitely feels like a show that definitely picks up as it goes along. And there's a lot of interesting moments across this season. Some really fun vote offs, some really fun character moments. So while again, it does have a very slow start, I think by the end of it, this is actually a pretty strong season, and one that, and if you're just a fan of, again, middle school style Survivor, like kind of in a similar way to how I talked about Survivor NZ Thailand, I mean, this is definitely a season I would actually recommend, to where it's actually a pretty solid season here. But finally, let's wrap up the video by talking about the only non-English series I wanted to talk about here, and that is one that just recently started, that being Survivor Quebec, which I did have the opportunity of watching, as the episodes have been translated online. So this is a series that is going to continue. There will be a season 2. However, season 1 really didn't do much for me. I personally didn't find it that great. I mean, it's a series that, again, like considering it is currently running, you might want to watch it just for the sake of watching a new Survivor season that literally just aired the previous year. But it's a season that in many ways kind of reminds me of Survivor NZ in terms of how it's structured, but even worse, the way this season plays out is that there were 6 episodes a week, which is ridiculous. 4 30-minute episodes, or in the pre-merge, there's 1 episode that comprises of 1 entire round of gameplay, followed by an after show that for some reason they consider as an actual episode of the show. But then following that, there are then 4 episodes comprising of the next round of gameplay. Mind you, those 4 episodes are only 30 minutes apiece, but it's still ridiculous the way that the season is paced. Literally, the season ends up having 67 episodes, because there's literally also a massive stretch where no one goes home, where around the time of the merge, they then have a non-elimination round, and we also get the inclusion of Redemption Island in the post-merge to really drag out that portion of the game. And again, this season is at points kind of miserable because of just how long it gets dragged out. Because I think if it was condensed, again, it could have been a fine season of Survivor. Even then, I don't think it would be particularly great. But again, in many ways, it does remind me of Survivor Nicaragua. I'm hoping that they're able to change some things for the future to make the series better. But again, I think as of right now, as of just season 1, I would not fully recommend this season unless you're really just clamoring for more modern Survivor. And through that, I would recommend this more so than a lot of the older school international seasons. But I just feel like there's obviously just better seasons to watch than this. But there we go. I mean, that is my redo of my guide to International Survivor. Now, this is really just the start of my series of redoing a whole bunch of videos for the 5-year anniversary of the channel, where, again, I do intend on redoing a lot of season rankings, of winner rankings, the who would I vote for videos. So, again, expect all those down the road. Obviously, outside that, expect just the typical style of content you can expect from this channel. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.